thanks for giving me this opportunity to share some of the thoughts that I have on the ways in which we need to think about neoliberalism, in particular with regard to the climate denial, climate obstruction research today. I'm sharing my screen now and hope that you can see the right first page of the presentation, which is tested it, so it should work. When Jose asked many weeks ago if I would take this assignment, and of course I was very pleased to say yes, and then of course comes always the difficulty of what do I actually want to do. And when times comes closer and the obligation more pressing, then of course all boils down to a certain amount of things that can be done. So I settled for this kind of content where we'll speak about some clarity that we have about neoliberalism and denial history, and some misunderstanding about neoliberalism in particular, as it is currently again on vogue and popping up, and so we need to think about it. I will present then a framework to study ideology and policy, and will rely here on Karl Mannheim, who some of you might know and many might not like, because at least on the left he has been sort of like attacked for having seemingly an understanding of sort of like a disconnect between the intellectual and the social world, which is actually not correct, which I hope to show. And then I will talk about the varieties of neoliberalism I will try to convey today. I will talk about what one could understand as instrumental neoliberalism, where neoliberalism is indeed a direct tool, an instrument of the fossil industry and concerned corporations and business interests, and switch then to discuss neoliberalism as a deep discursive resource, as something which is not as direct and instrumental as the first perspective. And then I will get to talk about very briefly about also future varieties that may come to play an important role, even with regard to the search for solutions to climate change. It's kind of nice to rely in much of what I do here on work that colleagues do that are partly in the room or in the climate social science network, which is great because we really kind of get together and share much of the disconnected research we're doing, so I can happily also pull some of it together today. So let's first talk about some of the clarity we have. I mean, it's all of you have seen these charts of the work that Greenpeace originally funded and started to look at the funding of climate denial by Exxon Secrets page, where we get, in particular about the United States, all the connections between famous advocates of denial like James Inhofe and famous American think tanks. And this is really only to say, well, that's a so well-established fact that there's really no doubt, as in climate science, that there is a strong connection between a certain community, certain groups of think tanks that all belong to this neoliberal conservative world. We know it from Riley Dunlap and Peter Jacques' work that there is such a strong coincidence that if we look at the Heritage Foundation's directory, we find the think tanks that are committed to denial. And if you look at the denial publications, they're basically all coming out from think tanks. And this can be extended to Europe, and the funding follow the money approach will then reveal that Exxon has been funding some of the European think tanks as well, and related fossil industry-based firms. So there is really hardly any doubt that there's a strong use that fossil industry forces make of this the think tank capacity to convey semi-expert messages, not to say claims to academic veracity and so on and so forth. So there's the complexity of policy making, as we all know, requires a lot of input from expertise, from science, from all kinds of sources. And that has, of course, on the other hand, led to the politicization of science. So in the science philosophical debates we have, it is important to recognize that on the one hand, we can have an academic discourse on what really constitutes science, but in policy making, this hardly matters in many areas. Maybe it matters in certain specialist circumstances, but in policy making, a lot of things get sold under the headline of science that are clearly not, and that's one of these problems, that we have a much broader competition about what counts as reliable expertise than maybe we had in some older days. But this is also not confined to the climate science field. I mean, look at economics. I mean, how many economic expertise is peddled as good expertise, and yet is disproven for years and decades, you know. So it's good to look at Lindsay McGoy's work, for example, on strategic ignorance, to basically not fall into the trap to be sort of like adjudicating what is proper science and what is not proper science, but recognize the ambiguities of science and policy making as an important task. But we have this very strong instrumentalization, and I don't need to repeat this. I want to get to some misunderstanding. Just recently, of course, with Joe Biden winning the elections in the United States, we have headlines again. Joe Biden's drive to end 40 years of neoliberal hegemony, and Biden and the waning of the neoliberal era. We can also go to Europe and have in the Green European Journal the claim of the end of neoliberal ideology. And this is, for me, of course, as a sort of expert on neoliberalism, that could be sad news, and I'm just peddling my own interest in continuing to sell my own research if I claim that this is highly problematic. But I guess many people will be with me that they have a little bit of doubt about the correctness of all these sort of like claims, because, not least, because we had similar claims 30 years ago with the end of the immediate Thatcher and Reagan era and the coming to power of the new Social Democrats who claimed to end neoliberalism. And then we had it, of course, after the global financial crisis. And now again, we have it, of course, with the pandemic crisis. And yet, in the past, we have seen then that neoliberalism had made astonishing comebacks, or rather never really disappeared. I have two quotes here to show you what I feel is really wrong with all these hopes of the end of neoliberalism. The first quote is from the Green Journal. One of the major neoliberal contradictions lies in the belief that the market economy is in itself stable, a few shared by monetarists such as Milton Friedman and orthodox economists more generally. And the second quote from the Roosevelt Institute, one of the sort of like new progressive institutes in the United States. Neoliberal leaders, backed by prevailing economic dogma, shaped government in the image of markets and convinced voters that only market solutions would suffice. Felix Yavon said this. Now, the problem is that this is not what neoliberals believe. So we have a tendency that people attribute to neoliberalism the image of the self-regulating market, the classical image of laissez-faire, the belief in markets are in themselves stable, or that only market solutions will survive. This is an image of, one could say, of propaganda of neoliberalism that is certainly easy to read, in particular in the heyday of the 70s and 80s, when Reagan would say the state is not the solution, the state is the problem, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the intellectual history of neoliberalism, it started on the position that that the market is not inherently stable, that capitalism needs stabilization, that a whole range of things are necessary to secure market orders. So basically, if we believe in this maybe easy strawman notion of neoliberalism as a market radicalism, then it is easy to see why very quickly in times of crisis it looks like it's over. But if you understand that neoliberalism is really about the re-regulation, the use of public policy for securing market orders, then we are in a different game. Then we see that actually neoliberals, much like other people, have a clear understanding of the need for public policy and the need for all kinds of instruments and solutions to deal with problems. And it's much more important to look at the more specific ways in which these different policies play out or are conceptualized. I propose here that we need an alternative framework to think about neoliberalism, that it's exactly the dual confrontation since the Great Depression between, on the one hand, the threat of collectivism, planning and socialism, and on the other hand, the limits of laissez-faire. So the recognition that there is something to be done, which many then already at the time have called the third way. There is a neoliberal core of property rights, of freedom of contract. So that means you can do with your money, so like you can engage in any kind of contract with others. And the rule of the law, which is already not just market radicalism, because without seeing that neoliberals rely on the rule of the law as an alternative, basically, to discretionary government, that immediately raises the question, so who is establishing the law, who is maintaining the law, and so on and so forth. So there is a public function in this, even in this core. Notably, it's not based in democracy. So we have this whole range of more authoritarian and more democratic varieties of neoliberalism in history. And that's no accident, because the primacy of the economic rights that are recognized in neoliberalism makes all the other political rights that were dear to liberals sort of like negotiable. We see that in the history of neoliberalism, we see the employment of imperium, the state, to protect what can be called dominion, the private business, civil society sphere. Quinn Slobody in his book has nicely spelled this out for the international order that belongs both to the domestic and the international sphere. So it's the employment of the state to protect the private sector and civil society rights within and across borders. And then we see a lot of pragmatism and flexibility, plus the historical evolution in the face of challenges, oppositions, and contestations. So neoliberalism is not stable. We need to get used to the fact that much like other ideologies, neoliberalism is necessarily reacting to what comes as challenges and finding its own ways to integrate these challenges or deal with them. So the most important message first is neoliberalism is not market fundamentalism. It's not just a story based on homo economicus, and it's not a pensée unique, as Pierre Bourdieu and others have held. If we deal with it like this, it's easy to sort of like reject it, but it misses the target, because in the Montparnasse Society, for example, a scholarly community of 1,200 scholars so far, many people have discussed many aspects of regulation and deregulation and re-regulation, and not just economists, but political scientists and historians and so on and so forth. So it's a transdisciplinary group of scholars. So what I think what we need to recognize that neoliberalism, much like conservatism, much like socialism, much like any other competing ideology, like feminism, like ecological thinking, needs to actually develop and meet challenges over time to survive, because otherwise it becomes orthodox and dies. And that's why we see the changes, for example, in conservative ideologies, which have traveled afar, and long way, of course, to modern conservatism. Also, the United States conservatism seems to be on the road back again. So it's not stable. It's actually frequently a quite dynamic development. And I want to propose that we think of Mannheim here as a good student in this way, because he has extensively studied the historical evolution of conservatism, for example. And I like to use him also because he explains that, for example, the immediate representation of interests, capitalists have their interests or workers have their interests in ideology, is one way of a dimension of the link between interests and idea, between individuals and ideas, which he calls the notion of interestedness. And then there is also the indirect relations. He clarifies there is no possibility to de-link the world of ideas from the socio-economic circumstances. So he is absolutely continuing the sort of like historical materialist project of Marxism in this regard. But then he is sort of like paying more attention to diverse ways in which socioeconomic realities translate into or get expressed in the realm of ideas. And the indirect relations are important because here he captures something where basically we see that there's not necessarily a direct financing payment for certain intellectuals to take certain positions, but there is links. Say the rise of, in Austrian economics, the rise of neoclassical economics has not been directly funded by some sort of like capitalist interest. But of course, it had an important role in going against the, at the time, certainly a strong Marxist notion of the labor theory of value. Turning the value theory into a price theory was very useful for capitalist development, even if it was not directly funded and directed by individual capitalist interests. So there is a link between, there's a possibility, and Mannheim recognizes this immediate interestedness in the world of ideas, and then the sort of like more indirect ways of which he calls committedness, where the socioeconomic realities lead to expressions in the intellectual realm that cannot be disconnected, but that are also not immediately tied to a specific interest position. And the intellectuals as a group, and that's his notion as the free-floating intellectual, they're not necessarily tied to any specific social group. They are basically flexible. They can be organic intellectuals of the ruling class. They can be, of course, also organic intellectuals of the opposition classes. Think of Fritz Engels or Karl Marx. They didn't come from the proletarians, but they became intellectuals of the working classes and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very useful approach to basically look at the direct and the indirect links of ideas in society. I need to pay attention that I don't take up too much time. So if we look at the immediate interestedness links, we can of course draw on the work of Jeremy Walker, from whom I borrow the terminology of fossil neoliberalism, where we have basically a very close identity between the work of early neoliberals and the idea that there is an immediate link to the interests of the early, of important people from fossil capital, like Rockefeller, who was very influential. The Rockefeller Foundation was very influential in supporting neoliberal intellectuals in the interwar era. And of course, fossil industries were important parts of the International Chamber of Commerce, many of who were home in the Swiss Institute for International Studies among the early neoliberals in the 1930s, were also close to these fossil capital forces. Then, of course, there was a massive involvement of fossil interests in the post-World War II development of neoliberal networks. In the 1970s, of the anti-environmental movement, the fights against the mineral sovereignty of the third world. I mean, there was massive overlap between neoliberals and fossil industry interests. And then, of course, we have the selective employment of neoliberal forces to advance fossil agendas, where Charles Koch, of course, as a member of the Montparnasse Society, is a very important donor of many of these think tanks. We see the excellent strategy I mentioned before. And So in this regard, with regard to this immediate interestedness and the links, it's actually a lot of rich empirical material, and it's an empirical question. Who is doing what with whom in this field? And it's very, very rich, and by far we don't know enough yet, which I show very briefly. But there's a couple of issues with this perspective. There's one, on the one hand, the fossil interest groups, they precede neoliberalism, of course. So fossil interests didn't sort of like coincide fully with neoliberalism. And if eventually we will get out of fossil industries, possibly at the end of the great transformation we all work for, the question would be, would there be then no neoliberalism anymore? If there's this full identity. And if we cannot answer this question in the positive, then of course we have to acknowledge that there's a possibility of not a full coincidence of neoliberalism and fossil interests. And in fact, there's a range of other interests with which neoliberalism coincides. But still, I don't want to diminish the research agenda in this regard, because a person like Jesper E. Crane, who was invited by Hayek to the founding meeting as a guest, he explicitly mentioned he didn't want him as a full member at the time, because he was afraid that the neoliberal meeting would basically be considered too much of a business interest-driven meeting. Because Jesper Crane was vice president of DuPont, and DuPont was, of course, not only producing gunpowder, but also a lot of oil-related equipment and plastics, so was deeply involved in fossil industry things. He was also one of the strongest shareholders of General Motors at the time, DuPont, and had to divest from GM only in the 1950s on an antitrust case. Other direct linkages we see is that they were producing the fluorocarbons that, of course, fed the refrigerators, and that were becoming the key culprit for the ozone hole. And one of the villains of Naomi Oreskes and other stories, Fred Seitz, was a 35-year consultant with DuPont. So we see that we have very important immediate overlaps between people that are in the realm of fossilism and in the realm of sort of like neoliberalism. And I'm absolutely not downplaying the need for this research agenda. I'm only arguing it is not enough, basically, to look for this immediate interestedness in the direct business links, that we have, unfortunately, to deal with a richer variety of neoliberal influence that is relevant in the climate policy field. So I want to distinguish from this interestedness the committedness of useful neoliberalism, and I want to use, on the one hand, Ludwig von Mises and his theory of action, or praxeology, as one of the sort of like inputs that one could call a deep discourse, which I hope to convince you that is then actually mobilized in the climate denial world. The praxeology of Mises is quickly explained. He distinguishes three types of action. There's free exchange, market relations if you want, in his reading. There's coercive action, the state, for example. And there's retaliation from these people that are, for example, coerced and then rebel by not paying taxes, for example. And basically on this very simple triad of types of action, Ludwig von Mises builds not only his economic theory in the Austrian economics tradition, but claims that this is the theory of human action. So he has a really broad and a big claim on social science, on a general social science, on this basic, on this axiomatic. He is really, in terms of science philosophy, that's an idealist conception, because it's based on a priorism. So it's a deductive model that the basic assumptions of which cannot be challenged. So he falls back in terms of science philosophy to the modern understanding that everything is subject to the test in experience, and that theories need to be in conversation with empirical realities. And so that's not his science world. And of course, he's a complete outsider with this science philosophy. And yet, this kind of science philosophical underpinnings play a tremendous role in the mobilization against climate sciences, because it's one reservoir in scientific debates to claim that science, that other sciences like climate sciences, for example, are not scientific in the way they are constructed. Of course, the experts will completely be in disagreement with these claims, but the community of Mises scholars have their own reference point. Now, in terms of the climate debate, of course, it's very immediately obvious that if you have a normative positive understanding of free exchange and a normative negative understanding of coercive action, then you are in the world of anti-interventionism. State is basically not good because it's coercive. This extends to democracies because majoritarian democracies force minorities to accept rules. And that in the world of sort of like a normative free market idea is bad. And not only is there a negative idea about kind of a public order that is based on such coerciveness, there's also a positive alternative to it, and that's consumer democracy. The market is basically more democratic in this understanding than the public order, than the democracy based on one person, one vote, and the ways in which representative democracy gets to policy making. Because here, the idea is that the consumer is actually the right judge to decide what is best and what is good, and will be willing to pay the price for the things he or she wants. And it's very easy to see how this plays a certain role in the objection against certain types of climate policies, and is actually possibly useful in supporting other types of environmental policies. So based on Mises, of course, we get this idea about an open global economy, an uninhibited price system on the belief that entrepreneurship is far and wide and very, very productive, and only unproductive if it's prevented by coercive action. And then there's this science philosophical resource. It's very interesting how this notion of the sovereign consumer is actually researched and sort of like is, despite the fact that Mises is in many ways, of course, a completely outdated economist, plays a tremendous role in the mobilization in various schools, from the social market economy in Germany to the post-war developments of the American neoliberals and conservatives. Now, if we read very recently about the research findings of Naomi Oreskes and Geoffrey Supran of how Exxon uses the kind of individual consumer responsibility frame to kind of deflect attention from the responsibility of the likes of the corporation for the climate catastrophe we're headed towards, then we kind of nicely see the ways in which such a deep ideology of consumer sovereignty, of consumer responsibility, can be put to good use in sort of like suggesting to people that it's not your fault if you behave correctly, or it's your fault if you actually continue to eat meat, fly planes, drive cars, and so on and so forth. And as long as these people do not reflect on the collective opportunities to change the structure of consumption, production and consumption, it's all good from the perspective of those who want to deflect attention from the sort of like structural conditions of climate change and causes. And I'm expecting that the nanny-state index, Timbro, the Swedish think tank mentioned before today, together with friends in Europe, has been setting up to address the restrictions on what we eat, what we smoke, what we drink, so the kind of alcohol, tobacco, and so on, campaigns that they may soon include driving cars, for example, as you know, which countries are extremely restrictive against consumers to drive fossil cars, you know, and so on and so forth. It's a good example of the nanny-state index showing how countries are not free and The green area is the countries which leave consumers the freedom of choice. And I'm happy to say that in Germany, I'm much more free than you damned Norwegians and Finns in this regard, from the perspective of the Swedish think tank Timbro. So this was my committedness opportunity number one of a discourse that is mobilized in direct and indirect ways in the climate discourse. And now the second one we have already heard a bit about today as well. It's Hayek's turn towards information economics. I think I need to keep it pretty short here. Just historically, of course, we all know that in economics, the basic definition of the economics is how we use scarce resources for alternative ends. So there's a notion resources are scarce and there's different things that may get produced or not. And sort of like that's the basic definition of economic decision-making, of economic action. And actually Lionel Robbins, Hayek's sort of like mentor at the LSE, was himself proposing this definition in the 1930s still. And here we actually have a definition which still leaves economics in the realm of the relationship of humans and nature. You know, there's a notion of scarcity. There's a notion of there's real materials. There's sort of like decision making about things to build, to do, and wealth is sort of like concrete in terms of products and buildings and materials and so on and so forth. And there's actually expertise related to these relationships. You can struggle about, you know, the ways in which these experts have real expertise or not, but it's really an expertise about economics talking about human nature relationships. Now, the new economics that Hayek came to conceive from the 1940s onward is actually disconnecting nature from economics. It's basically reconceiving economics as a question of knowledge transformed into bits and pieces of information that are dispersed in society. All the market participants have such information, and it cannot be sort of like easily put together. That's the objection against planning, against the planned economy. But there is luckily, fortunately, a mechanism that is helpful here. And that mechanism is the market as a communication machine. And Hayek actually in the pieces he writes on this is very quick to admit it's not perfect. So, sorry, market radicalism. It's even the conception of market radicalism acknowledges it's not perfect, but it's important that he thinks it's better than alternatives. The market as information processor is not working perfectly and smoothly, but it is superior to alternative efforts to sort of like pull these informations together. In 1952, he got deeper into knowledge as a tacit sort of like element. So until 1952, he didn't even think of, he still conceived of knowledge in a traditional way. Then he started to conceive of knowledge as something which is actually inaccessible to self-examination. So knowledge is something we don't know. So that's a very strong objection against science. And in competition as a discovery process, and here I rely on the work of Phil Mirowski and his colleague Nika, I quote, epistemology is governed now by competition as a procedure for the discovery for such facts as, without resort to it, would not be known to anyone. The knowledge of which we speak consists rather of a capacity to find about the particular circumstances which becomes effective only if the possessors of this knowledge are informed by the market. So there's suddenly a notion that knowledge at the end is only produced, and the sort of like knowledge that is good knowledge is only produced if it is produced by the market. And here, of course, we enter a realm of sort of like goodbye to science in general, because the basic and important facts of life then need to be produced sort of like by market processes and not by sort of like the academic world. That's also what Donald Rumsfeld then called unknown unknowns in his famous speech. And at this point also Hayek is introducing this understandings of the future is unknown, everything is left to evolutionary processes, which is of course a very strong shield against the idea that you will plan a transformation process to escape the dangers of global warming. There's no objection against every type of action. So there's sort of like the opportunity always to rely on Popper, the close friend of Hayek and colleague in the modern society, to do certain types of piecemeal engineering, to kind of small experiments that can be sort of like changed and cut back again. But there is a certain idea that you should definitely not think of a trajectory where humans, based on what kind of knowledge they can amass in scientific processes, will sort of like plan the future life in society. And alternatively, there is a need to rely on the information that is produced by markets. And of course, we know that much of the turn towards economic instruments in policymaking relies on precisely the argument that this is a superior knowledge to the command and control technologies that are otherwise proposed by environmental scientists and whoever. So there's a strong claim here, epistemological claim and redirection of economics, that Hayek is not sort of like alone to produce, but there's also Stiglitz, quite on the opposite side of the political spectrum of the neoliberals and neocons, a progressive economist, but he's likewise very convinced about the revolutionary importance of the information recognition in policymaking. He only disagrees that Hayek's assertion that markets act efficiently, but again, Stiglitz, sorry, Hayek never said that markets act necessarily efficiently. The theories of market efficiency that were later propagated by Lucas and so on and so forth are sort of like one realm of neoliberal developments, and certainly a very problematic one. But the basic idea of Hayek is not caught with this attack. And we find here a nice contrast between Hayekians and Stiglitzians by this Austrian economics blocks, where basically it's nicely summarized. Hayek would have the government tolerate messy competition. His point is that with the optimal outcome unknown, government resolution of issues shuts off the learning process that market competition provides. So if we produce a regulatory order that cuts back on market mechanisms, then we shut out the search mechanism for the good solutions in the Hayekian idea. Stiglitz instead sees the messiness in real world economies, and he claims to have the right solution in every case. Stiglitz's outlook is that markets are imperfect, but he is not. Were Marx of a dictatorship of the proletariat, Stiglitz would give us dictatorship of the Nobel laureate. Between the two, we might be safer with Marx, says this Austrian economist. But it is basically playing on this claim that economists like Stiglitz claim that they are basically able to sort of like provide a solution. But he doesn't address what actually Stiglitz and many other economists have bought into, namely that the market process is changed into this information exchange mechanism that may need to be adjusted. That's basically the strong history in environmental economics, that the information of the market need to be internalized, external effects. We need prices for carbon so that the market can work efficiently. Here you see basically an effort to bring Hayek's ideas of the information process into sort of like the efforts to deal with the problems of environmental economics. But again, if we are believing in sort of like the market as an information processing machine, then we already buy into a notion that this is in a way superior knowledge produced by the market, rather than suggesting, well, in economics, we can only deal with so many questions. And maybe in many areas of environmental climate change related issues, we actually do not need to resort to economics. We may need to resort to other sciences. And if you buy into the sort of like economics reasoning that Hayek has introduced, you're already buying very strongly into such a change in the conception of economics. We see to what this leads, or how this becomes a useful resource. For example, in the German debate on there was an enquete commission debating the growth model, growth, wealth, and life quality from 2010, 2013, addressing the question, should we go beyond growth, economic growth? And one of the experts, Karl-Heinz Parquet, an MPS member and strong advisor of the German Liberal Party, he actually wrote lots of his expertise where people suggested we need to cut back on growth. And he argued against this perspective that this amounts to nothing but censorship, because growth in his terms, in Hayekian terms, is an increase in information that the market produces. And of course, if you argue that you need to cut back on growth, this is, for us, it's maybe something that has to do with preventing emissions and negative externalities and so on and so forth. For him, it's basically preventing information to be exchanged. And that is censorship. So it's an authoritarian mechanism that we are used to deal with in authoritarian systems, and we should not rely on in free societies. And that's a mobilization we see that is sort of like coming from this trajectory, and is mobilized in climate debates, and is certainly visible in all the arguments where we see that market mechanisms are claimed to be superior to traditional command and control mechanisms. I'm getting towards the end very quickly now, because I need to. So very quickly about expectations. The way in which we saw that these neoliberal ideas diffuse in society, in academic disciplines, in discourses, in climate debates, lead us, I think, very far away from the kind of immediate interest that Exxon and others exert on certain denial forces, and lead us much more into the ways in which competing ideologies, be they social democratic, be they green environmentalist, be they conservative, actually get transformed under the influence of neoliberal ideas, which to a certain extent they adapt and adjust and take on board. And that's, I think, why we see a lot of new liberalization of social democracy, of conservatism, even of green economic, of green environmental thinking, because a lot of the influence of neoliberal ideology is becoming visible in these kind of ways of concepts, how concepts are used, how economic claims are sort of like shared, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, environmental economists do not have to be vested in Hayekian or Stiglitz sort of like understanding. We can see new environmental economists who actually throw the kind of epistemology of Hayek overboard and go back here to the traditional understanding of the human nature relationship and how to deal with it. We sort of like, it's not enough to just emphasize asymmetries of information, for example, and market failure. It's much more important to take exactly this global challenges of human nature relationships as an economic question on board and address it in basically the ways that possibly help us to solve it. So, and that's why it is not necessary that this trajectory is completely taking over, but that's an empirical question again. What kind of economists play a role at the IPCC? What kind of economic debates sort of like come out? And even among neoliberals, of course, we don't need to have a vested interest in these kind of trajectories, because based on the neoliberal core of property rights and freedom of contract and the rule of the law, you can imagine there is a new neoliberal community shaping that objects against the privileges of fossil property rights. I mean, if the global warming scenarios develop as they do, a lot of property will be destroyed because fossil property rights are privileged. And that is a challenge that neoliberal ideology has certainly to confront, and I'm absolutely certain will confront, and actually there are signs that there are these discussions. Stefan Lewandowski has discussed some of the libertarian varieties that are also addressing this. But I also I want to convey the message that we should not take for granted that neoliberalism is something that is now built in stone and then is swept away with the next flooding. But it's human beings, academics, intellectuals that deal with problems and compete in the public arenas, in discourses and in policy making for attention like everybody else, and try to develop solutions. And so, of course, we have new networks like the new network in Network of Order Economics in Freiburg, and international, also connected to international networks where they discuss to go back to the colloquial to Lippmann of 1938, the moment where neoliberalism was conceived, because they feel it needs to be reconceived today. And much depends on what's going on in the networks of think tanks like the Mises Institute, which will be on the reactionary part of the climate networks and more to the instrumental sides. But you see that they have been mobilized after 2010. So after the global financial crisis, much like the Atlas Network has been basically built up after the global financial crisis. And we all don't believe that the people who invest money and resources in these think tanks that are committed to neoliberal ideas will just stop doing what they have been doing. And it will be most important also in the next stage of public policy and discursive contestations to deal with what they put out and what they propagate as sort of like options and possibilities for the future, because they will remain a force. They're very entrenched globally, and they will remain a force to be reckoned with. And I think I'm arguing we better know what's going on in these circles and be sort of like open-minded about what they do, to be not misled by sort of like certain assumptions that may actually prove not exactly right, and underestimate sort of like the possible future influence of neoliberals on climate policy making. Thank you.